Today we're going to finish the third division of Beyond Good and Evil, Part 3, What is Religious? And we're going to start in where we left off last time at section number 47. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Wherever on earth the religious neurosis has appeared, we find it tied to three dangerous dietary demands: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. But one cannot decide with certainty what is cause and what effect, and whether any relation of cause and effect is involved here. The final doubt seems justified because among its most regular symptoms, among both savage and tame peoples, we also find the most sudden, most extravagant voluptuousness, which then just as suddenly changes into a penitential spasm and denial of the world and will, both perhaps to be interpreted as masked epilepsy, but nowhere should one resist interpretation more. No other type has yet been surrounded by such a lavish growth of nonsense and superstition. No other type seems to have interested men, even philosophers, more. The time has come for becoming a bit cold right here, to learn caution, better yet to look away, to go away." End quote. So he's talking about the ascetic here, the sage, the religious figure. No one has captivated the human imagination more than the priest. And Nietzsche is going to get into talking about why that is, or one reason why, a little further in the text, but it's something that he's brought up elsewhere. The priest, the ascetic, he hints at it here, they appear unusual or outstanding to us, peculiar, a sort of mystery, in that they have these three, what Nietzsche calls dangerous dietary demands: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. And we might notice solitude is something that Nietzsche praises. So that's one of the things that he might say was a positive virtue of the priest or the ascetic, the holy man, right? Or the way he talks about it in the Untimely Meditations, the saint. This is the first such archetype that gives us a higher image of man that is no longer the animal, that has in some way overcome his animal instincts and showed the way forward, a path of transformation to something higher. He's the first moral exemplar of the human species. This is dangerous, right? And Nietzsche is going to get into talking about why this is. But it's also, the discipline that is shown or revealed in the archetype of the priest, to be able to withhold from indulging in all of these worldly needs and instincts that we would think are common to all men and unavoidable. We have to satiate all these urges and instincts. And the priest stands there in judgment of us as one who doesn't. But he says, nowhere should we resist interpretation more. We have to be a little bit colder because the priest, we have to remember that we have just attributed so much of this mystery to the priest and this divinity, this holy importance, this sort of awe, right? Reverential awe towards something that has been regarded as like a sacred figure. So we don't really question it, right? And so we have to be able to look away from perhaps the icon of the priest, right? The image that we've created of the priest, even to go away from it, meaning to go in a different direction from the path forward for humanity that the priest suggests to us. But, and one final aspect of that little chunk that I just read, I want to talk about the most extravagant voluptuousness, which changes into a penitential spasm, penitence, repentance. He's pointing to this idea that the saint arises among these peoples where he almost seems like a reversal of what we might call a more life-oriented or physical world-oriented moral approach to the world. The priest represents a sort of spasmodic rejection and proceeding in the opposite direction of rejecting all the good things of the world, all the worldly pleasures. This happens at the time of the most extravagant voluptuousness. So we'll continue. Quote, "Even in the background of the most recent philosophy, that of Schopenhauer, we find almost as the problem in itself," and I'm going to break in here briefly. Problem in itself is hyphenated, so thing in itself. So the problem in itself, right? Schopenhauer's treating this problem as though it's like an objective, a problem inherent in existence, something that might be universal or transcend Schopenhauer's perspective, But we should know better than that by now. But Nietzsche is just pointing out how this problem has been made into that in Schopenhauer's mind. And so Nietzsche continues in the passage, quote, "This gruesome question mark of their religious crisis and awakening. How is the denial of will possible? How is the saint possible?" This really seems to have been the question over which Schopenhauer became a philosopher and began. And so it was a genuinely Schopenhauerian conclusion when his most convinced adherent, perhaps also the last one as far as Germany is concerned, namely Richard Wagner, finished his life's work at precisely this point, and in the end brought this horrible and eternal type on stage as Kundry, type Viku in the flesh. At the very same time, when the psychiatrists of almost all the countries of Europe had occasion to study it at close quarters, wherever the religious neurosis, or whatever I call die religiöse Wesen, had its latest epidemic outbreak and pageant in the Salvation Army. So there's a lot there. Wagner, at the end of his life, this is sort of shed light on by a passage, I believe, in Nietzsche contra Wagner. Nietzsche says that Wagner was sort of like, he imagines him as a man metaphorically sailing forward on a new path for Germany, and then he shipwrecks on a reef, and that reef is called Schopenhauer's philosophy. And since Wagner doesn't have the strength or perhaps the vision to see beyond where he is shipwrecked, Wagner declares this shipwreck as the goal. Oh, well, this is the goal. This is the blessed island that I was trying to arrive at, is this coral reef that I've shipwrecked on. And the reason why Nietzsche thinks this is because Wagner is playing out. Nietzsche gets his picture of how pessimism develops from Wagner, right? It's the decline of your energy, your strength to carry on in the world, and so you then begin to revere the sacred value of non-activity, of withdrawal from the world, of the saintly life, of the life that's aimed at nothing within the world. When you become a weary type of person, which he believes Wagner does, you then begin to reify and deify that idea. And this is the problem in itself for Schopenhauer, which, by the way, Nietzsche, as a former disciple of Schopenhauer, would say these are actually very good questions to ask. How is the denial of the will possible? How is the saint possible? So that's the question that dominates Schopenhauer's outlook and philosophy. And in a way, I wouldn't say those are necessarily the questions that dominate Nietzsche's entire philosophy, but we can see how jumping off from those questions, you can get to all of the sort of the philosophical questions that are central to Nietzsche's project. And I guess the final thing I would say is that I want to point out he has called it the religious neurosis twice now. So I described it in the last section when we began, we started with the beginning, the sort of the teaser aphorisms of this section. Nietzsche's treating religion as a pathology here. And so what he's pointing out with Wagner and Schopenhauer is that they have made the religious figure of the ascetic, they're sacralizing it again through philosophy and through this cultural movement and music, just at the moment where that gloomy and more honest 19th century that's bringing out, uncovering all that is animal and instinctual in man, and getting into the physical, the guts of the human organism for the first time, and we're standing at the point where we could demystify the figure of the saint and the religious psychology. And, just at the time when the psychiatrists of almost all countries of Europe had occasion to study it at close quarters, the religious neurosis, and really come into an understanding of it. And remember, psychology, this is the route to the deepest questions. So let's finish out this passage. Quote, "Let us ask what precisely about this whole phenomenon of the saint has seemed so enormously interesting to men of all types and ages, even to philosophers. Beyond any doubt, it was the air of the miraculous that goes with it, namely the immediate succession of opposites, of states of the soul that are judged morally in opposite ways. It seemed palpable that a bad man was suddenly transformed into a saint, a good man. The psychology we have had so far suffered shipwreck at this point. Wasn't this chiefly because it had placed itself under the dominion of morals, because it too believed in opposite moral values and saw, read, interpreted these opposites into the text and the facts? What? The miracle merely a mistake of interpretation? a lack of philology, end quote. I don't know if I sold that correctly. That was a question mark at the end. But a lack of philology, right? In each his own scientific field. We haven't been sufficiently scientific enough in our search for truth. And so in our interpretations of the saint, we look at this succession of opposites. Great example, I'll give you one from the East, Angulimala. This is a very famous story in the Buddhist canon. Angulimala is a bandit. He's called that because I believe I believe it means finger necklace, and he has a necklace of fingers he's cut off. He's a terrifying bandit who just murders people and takes their money. And one day the Buddha goes and he converts Angulimala miraculously. We could compare this to another figure, St. Paul, who has his road to Damascus experience. Paul is like a murderer and oppressor of Christians, and then he sees, the figure of Christ, just the way that this murderous bandit sees the figure of Buddha. And then they both engage in like a penitent course in life. Like in Angulimala's case, people know who he was. He becomes a monk, and so he'll go out and beg for his food with the other monks, and people just throw rocks at him and call him names because they're like, fuck you, you're the guy who killed my uncle or whatever when you robbed him on the road. But Buddha, counsels Angulimala, hey, this is working through your bad karma, right? So he becomes the kind of man who, like a martyr or a saint, is willing to endure the slings and arrows of others, or sometimes literally, with a kind of forbearance, from being the kind of person who would just kill you from looking at him the wrong way, or just kill you for fun. So how could these complete opposite states of the soul occur, this absolute transformation in this one individual? And because the reason why then we made the mistake about the saint and who the saint was is because of this faith in opposite values that we talked about all the way back in episode 1, which comes from this idea of substance or thingness to things, this hangover from Kantianism, that things are things in themselves. Good has a good essence, evil has an evil essence. And then we see, the evil essence subsumed or sublated or overcome in a single soul by the good. And it's like night and day. Murderer to the kind of person who will endure any kind of pain or torment and be martyred even for his faith. The total pacifist. And so because of this intermediary interpretation of reality, of good and evil as things with substances which are mutually exclusive and opposed, we failed to see what you might have already figured out as I'm talking about this, at least maybe in the back of your mind from all the things that we've talked about in Beyond Good and Evil up to this point, that perhaps the good and evil of the saint and the way that we've talked about with a character like Angulimala, maybe these are not opposites. Maybe they're simply gradations. Maybe one is actually the foundation of the other. And, a quick way of putting this, I suppose, is that the saint or the ascetic, as Nietzsche has hinted earlier in the text, might have actually been the most evil man in his community, right? In terms of his internal content. He might have felt the wayward, vicious, immoral urges more strongly than anyone else. And what this prompted then was for him to cultivate a stronger discipline over those impulses than anyone else had, which eventually reaches the point of a complete fasting, a complete abstinence from certain impulses, natural animal impulses in human beings. And this mystery, right, if we're still thinking in terms of essential categories of good and evil as to how this could have happened, and not a psychological process wherein good can actually be based on the evil, we made a mistake about the saint. He became a mystery, a paradox, an enigma to us, proof of the divine power of the Godhead to transform, to do alchemy, right? To transform lead into gold, to transform the bad into the good, by failing to see the person as a living thing that is dominated, the psychology that exists as a process and as a dynamic, as something moving, and as something that, seen from one perspective or manifest in one way, could be vicious and in another way virtuous. And so we were seduced by our own interpretation. Okay, 48, let's move on. Quote, "It seems that Catholicism is much more intimately related to the Latin races than all of Christianity in general is to us Northerners, and unbelief therefore means something altogether different in Catholic and Protestant countries. Among them, a kind of rebellion against the spirit of the race, while amongst us it is rather a return to the spirit or anti-spirit of the race. We Northerners are undoubtedly descended from barbarian races, which shows in our talent for religion. We have little talent for it." End quote. So we might recall last time when he was talking about his interpretation of Northern versus Southern Christianity, who are the representatives from Northern Christianity. He talks about Cromwell. He talks about, most importantly, Luther. Luther is the systematizer. He makes Christianity, he purifies the religion in the way the Germans purify their beer. I'm stealing that metaphor from Hans-Georg Muller, who recently talked about this. He wants to have a clean religion with that is logical, that doesn't require the sacrifice of the intellect, that doesn't permit any bending of the doctrines. Right? You're just supposed to, in the Catholic religion, acknowledge these human beings, these living people, these priests, and their whole earthly power structure as the earthly authority on how to interpret the religion. And this sometimes requires a sacrifice of the intellect, where you see or hear things within the going-ons of the Catholic Church that you might object to, but you give it up to faith, right? That God has put these people in charge. This is what he's talking about here, in that a kind of rebellion against the spirit of the race is what unbelief means in the Catholic countries. But for the Protestants, it's a return to the spirit of the race, that we're barbarians who have little talent for religion. And this is, I think, indirectly, Nietzsche's pointing out how Christianity, dominated as it has been by Northern Christianity and Protestantism, with the ascendance of the British Empire and later America, and of course the Dutch, has become a religion that continually rebels against itself. And that's in a way what, the Great Schism and the Protestant Reformation and the Scientific Enlightenment and all of these, Christianity is in constant rebellion against itself. But that's sort of the Northern Christian spirit, whereas the Catholic spirit is to not rebel and to allow for those tensions to exist and to just submit on the basis of faith. Okay, I'm going to skip over where he talks about France, and basically the rest of the sentences the passage is just him talking about how the French, with their Celtic blood, the Celts they furnish the best soil for the spread of the genuine Christian infection to the north, right? So genuine Christianity, original Christianity, is more of the southern variety, the sacrifice of the intellect, this submission to faith. There is something really, what would you say? Nietzsche would think there's something very dangerous and sort of maladaptive in crossing the spirit of Northern Europe with that of Southern Europe, which is what happens in Protestantism. And so the interesting part is where he talks about Renan. This is a philosopher, psychologist that Nietzsche has responded to before, and he quotes him at length in French. I'm going to read you the English translation of what Renan writes. He says, quote, "So let us make bold to say that religion is a product of the normal man. That man is closest to the truth when he is most religious and most certain of an infinite destiny. It is when he is good that he wants virtue to correspond to an eternal order. It is when he contemplates things in a disinterested manner that he finds death revolting and absurd. How can we but suppose that it is in moments like this that man sees best?" End quote. Nietzsche writes, quote, "These sentences are so utterly antipodal to my ears and habits that on finding them my first wrath wrote on the margin, la niaiserie religieuse par excellence." So that's the religious foolishness par excellence, right? "But my subsequent wrath actually took a fancy to them. These sentences standing truth on her head, it is so neat, so distinguished to have one's own antipodes." End quote. Yes, it is Nietzsche. He's basically the ending. That's an experience I've had where I've encountered something where I'm like, I disagree with this so strongly. It stirs my wrath, right? My intellectual wrath. But then on a little cool reflection, you realize this is so valuable to have as an example, as the incarnation of what I disagree with, put into words by someone else, right? That's a very valuable thing to contrast yourself with. It's so neat, so distinguished to have one's antipodes. And as to why it's antipodal, Renan is saying that the normal man, right? So the person, he's saying we're closest to the truth when we're most religious. I mean, you could just obviously say that you can obviously see why Nietzsche would disagree with that. But Nietzsche thinks that, especially as someone himself who has been, spent hours in deep solitary contemplation of, his pain from his medical condition, his place in the universe, he feels like this intense sort of suffering that he's gone through has made him more profound, which is a claim that is actually made by Christianity in a way. But what Nietzsche has found at the end of that, when he's thought the most deeply and, in his view, dispassionately about reality, is the complete opposite of what Renan is saying. And so it sort of maybe raises the question to Nietzsche as to whether Renan even knows what he's talking about here. And he's also holding up the normal man, the person who has been shaped by the conventional morality and the incentive structure created by the herd morality, as, who we should look to find the truth. And Nietzsche believes the exact opposite. Okay. 49, quote, "What is amazing about the religiosity of the ancient Greeks is the enormous abundance of gratitude it exudes. It is a very noble type of man that confronts nature and life in this way. Later, when the rabble gained the upper hand in Greece, fear became rampant in religion too, and the ground was prepared for Christianity." End quote. So, a couple interesting things about this short passage. The Greeks have a religion of gratitude. They're constantly giving thanks to the gods for protecting me and staying your wrath with me for one more day and allowing me to live in this beautiful world, for I'd rather be a farmhand in this beautiful world than a great hero in the underworld, right? That life is good, and I'm grateful to the gods to have life. And this is a noble type of person. So that's like the trusting fatalism, right? Nietzsche reads this into the Greek morality from his study of philology. Fear becomes rampant in religion when the rabble gain the upper hand in Greece. Nietzsche talks about fear as being the sort of the primordial origins of the slave morality. A lot of people talk about resentment or pity, but if you remember, going all the way back to our episode on the master and slave morality, fear is primary. Fear of the other, fear of harm. It's because evil is the primary orientation in the good and evil moral system, right? And then we find that the good man is what? The harmless man, the man that we don't fear. Evil, the concept of evil, forms first and foremost out of fear. And so even though you have these positive feedback loops and creativity through these values, which are then nurtured, such as resentment and pity, fear is really the primary basis of the ancient slave morality, you could say. And then by the combination of both fear and gratitude, what do you have? Christianity. That's where the ground is prepared. You notice he says that fear became rampant in religion also. It's not just it completely got rid of the noble gratitude orientation, but now, so this is like more, what would we say, the way, that element is still there when people say grace for their meals, right? When they give thanks, when they engage in thanksgiving to the God for what they've been given. But because of the fear that is core to the slave morality that Christianity comes out of, it brings with it all these other things. So anyway, I think that's all self-explanatory. 50, quote, "The passion for God. There are peasant types, sincere and obtrusive, like Luther. The whole of Protestantism lacks southern delicatezza. There is sometimes an oriental ecstasy worthy of a slave who, without deserving it, has been pardoned and elevated. For example, an Augustine who lacks, in a truly offensive manner, all nobility of gestures and desires. There is a womanly tenderness and lust that presses bashfully and ignorantly toward a unio mystica et physica, as in Madame de Guyon. In many cases, it appears oddly enough as a disguise for the puberty of a girl or youth, here and there even as a hysteria of an old mind, also as her final ambition, and in several such instances the Church has proclaimed the female a saint." So Madame de Guyon, she was a victim of the Inquisition. She, believed in the union of the mystical and the physical. Somebody who believes she had religious experiences, and we know how established church dogmas are towards those who have religious experiences, but he's talking about the passion for God. So remember, he's thinking about it as a pathology or a neurosis, and he brings up Luther. He's like, just a sincere, unobtrusive peasant type like Luther. Well, Luther had a series of religious experiences that he relates in his journals and writes about. You can read about those in William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. And it's like, in a way, this passage 50 is just Nietzsche as almost like a physician going and saying, who are the people who are most susceptible to being struck by this sincere religious passion, right? Sometimes seemingly out of nowhere. If we treat this as a mental condition in so many words, where does this come from? Well, let's look at who is most affected. And you could draw any number of interesting conclusions from the selection of peoples that he suggests the religious pathology takes hold in most easily. 51, quote, so far the most powerful human beings have still bowed worshipfully before the saint as the riddle of self-conquest and deliberate final renunciation. Why did they bow? In him, and as it were behind the question mark of his fragile and miserable appearance, they sensed the superior force that sought to test itself in such a conquest, the strength of the will in which they recognized and honored their own strength and delight and dominion. They honored something in themselves when they honored the saint. Moreover, the sight of the saint awakened a suspicion in them. Such an enormity of denial, of anti-nature, will not have been desired for nothing, they said to and asked themselves. There may be a reason for it, some very great danger about which the ascetic, thanks to his secret comforters and visitors, might have inside information. In short, the powerful of the world learned a new fear before him. They sensed a new power, a strange as yet unconquered enemy. It was the will to power that made them stop before the saint. They had to ask him. End quote. And Nietzsche leaves a long dash there and leaves off, right? So we don't know what question the powerful men of the world always wanted to ask the saint, because assuredly it was something different in many different cases. But whatever their own personal great mystery was, whatever their own existential problems were, right? Surely this man has the answer to it. And we see something of the power and the allure, the temptation of the saint in that notion. But how do they become the kind of person who they would think would have such an answer in the first place? Well, it's what we made reference to earlier. They saw something they didn't understand in the saint. They're like, this denial, the self-denial that this person's engaged in. They see this like, imagine someone like Alexander the Great in front of Diogenes, right? Here's this man who chooses to live in abject conditions, whereas he's got this frail, old, raggedy, dirty physical form. And, Alexander is just enthralled with the figure of Diogenes on this account, even though he is this, ripped, guy who's attended to like crafting his physical body into, a masterpiece and becoming this powerful leader of nations and empires and this great conqueror. And he still wants to go over and talk to, he wants to go ask things of Diogenes, this old, frail, skin and bones philosopher who lives with the dogs. And so has it been with every powerful man and the priestly caste throughout history, is that they see something that they can't understand in the saint that speaks to a great power that he has. And therefore it's a great power that the saint has that they don't understand. And they respect the saint as someone who, Nietzsche believes all who want to obey have to learn, or all who wish to command must first learn how to obey. They have to learn how to obey themselves in some sense. And the saint is showing that he's a person who's a master at obeying himself. Or at least that's what they thought, right? Now, there might be something pathological about the saint, or something that is very morbid and disturbed about his psychology and his physiology that has made him the way that he is just sort of like a, I don't want to call him like a freak of nature, but Nietzsche, might think the The holy man is almost something like he's a pathological type of human being. He's out of the ordinary, but not in an admirable way. But nevertheless, this misinterpretation of the saint as the master of his own willpower. Because in many cases they may have actually been that, as we pointed out, that they may have had to have become that because they have the most morbid desires, the most the desires impress themselves more strongly onto the saint's psyche than anyone else. So, yeah, this is the perception that the saint does have a will to power that is incredibly strong. He's just directed that external cruelty, that external urge to dominate and control the world, and directed it inward. That's perceived maybe on some sort of unconscious level. And this will all be elaborated upon not only later in this section or this division of the text, but also in Genealogy of Morality. But that is why the saint or the ascetic has always been looked upon as this powerful, profound, deep figure that we then think he knows something we don't. That's a good way to put it. That's why they had to ask him those deep questions. What does he know that I don't know that makes him this figure of anti-nature, that makes him expend so much energy toward this control over himself to banish these impulses that for me, I celebrate as just human and part of me? What does he know that I don't? And that nagging question is what has distorted the image of the saint in our minds. 52, quote, "In the Jewish Old Testament, the book of divine justice, there are human beings, things, and speeches in so grand a style that Greek and Indian literature have nothing to compare with it. With terror and reverence, one stands before these tremendous remnants of what man once was, and will have sad thoughts about ancient Asia and its protruding little peninsula Europe, which wants by all means to signify as against Asia the progress of man. To be sure, whoever is himself merely a meager, tame domestic animal and knows only the needs of domestic animals, like our educated people of today, including the Christians of educated Christianity, has no cause for amazement or sorrow among these ruins. The taste for the Old Testament is a touchstone for the great and small. Perhaps he will find the New Testament, the book of grace, still rather more after his heart. It contains a lot of the real, tender, musty, true believer and small soul smell. To have glued this New Testament, a kind of rococo of taste in every respect, to the Old Testament, to make one book, as the Bible, as the book par excellence, that is perhaps the greatest audacity and sin against the spirit that literary Europe has on its conscience." End quote. So not only is this, there are the obvious things to point out. Nietzsche, advocating for the Old Testament over the New Testament, which I should point out the political or cultural ramifications of that is he directly says the Jewish Old Testament, it's so grand, in so grand a style, it's such powerful literature, so archetypally massive and monumental that even the Greeks and Indian mythology has nothing to compare with it. That is high praise from Nietzsche. And the New Testament, this is he says, whether one prefers the older New Testament is a touchstone for whether one's soul is great or small. The great souls will be gravitating towards the Old Testament. The New Testament has that musty, true believer, small soul smell, and the idea of fusing them together into one book, that they are just completely opposite inner spiritual content. That is the audacity and the sin of Christianity and Christendom. And to say this is the ultimate book is this, where anyone with a subtle eye for the actual, spiritual content of these books will recognize that the New Testament is like a stuck-on ersatz just glued on top of this, this gem of the old world, of old Asia, right, out of which all the European culture comes from originally, that we're just this little peninsula jutting out that sees itself as the true progress of man, but, which receives everything from Central Asia and, including the Old Testament, right? Including the New Testament, for that matter. But that, what Europe has on its conscience is in the founding of Christendom, in the early days of the church, in the beginnings of the medieval period, that the religious canon of Christianity includes both these texts. Okay, 53, quote, "Why atheism today? The Father in God has been thoroughly refuted. Ditto the judge, the rewarder, also his free will. He does not hear, and if he heard still, he would not know how to help. Worst of all, he seems incapable of clear communication. Is he unclear? This is what I found to be causes for the decline of European theism, on the basis of a great many conversations, asking and listening. It seems to me that the religious instinct is indeed in the process of growing powerfully, but the theistic satisfaction it refuses with deep suspicion." End quote. So the religious instinct is still growing. We're pouring that energy into other avenues, we'll say, and I won't elaborate on that because, what are people making into their idols outside of the God of the old Christian religion? But the theistic satisfaction, it refuses with deep suspicion. So our new mechanistic materialistic worldview doesn't offer us many of the psychological boons that Christianity gave us. And we talked about this a lot in season 2. Christianity gave us an ideal to strive for. It gave us the image of higher humanity. It gave us, on the more basic level for what you might call the concerns of the herd morality, right? But this is still very important. It comforts the heart in the way that no earthly philosophy really can. It provides that metaphysical comfort. So what's gone? The rewarder, right? The judge. We no longer sort of believe in this moral judgment at the end of our lives. And the Father in God has been thoroughly refuted as well, right? The image of higher humanity, the idealistic, perfect being from which we were begat, right? I would say there's something he's pointing to here. He says it's totally anecdotal. It's just from conversations. The problem of non-belief in and of itself is sort of a problem for Christianity. What do I mean by that? It's very strange that in a world with an all-powerful, all-knowing, and just and moral God, that we would not know for certain that this being existed, that his existence would be in some way hidden from us and not just imminently obvious to everyone. And increasingly, as the God of the gaps, right, as the sciences penetrate into all the workings of nature and don't find any of the evidence that we would maybe assume was there, and increasingly, what does he say? That God does not hear us. He doesn't hear our prayers, and he wouldn't know how to help, and he seems incapable of clear communication, right? He speaks to us through our priestly caste, through these raving pathological religious zealots, and old books with allusions to things that don't exist anymore, places and people and events, right? If you read the Old Testament and you want to read it well, you have to become very well researched in all of these things. So it's very, all these, as Emerson said, the time of miracles is long past, and Christianity is an event that happened in a historical past, as if God were dead, right? So in any case, the problem of non-belief, unlike the problem of evil, right, it doesn't point to some sort of flaw or fault in reality, except insofar as to say, this doesn't seem coherent to me, that if there were an all-powerful creator, we wouldn't know that it was there. And it's that continued silence and continued inability to find God in this mechanistic worldview that has made atheism like inevitability. I think if most of you are familiar with a lot of atheistic philosophy or arguments, as I'm sure many of you are, especially those of you who are my age, because that's what YouTube and a lot of the internet used to be, the philosophical internet. This is all pretty self-explanatory, so we'll move on. 54, quote, "What is the whole of modern philosophy doing at bottom? Since Descartes, actually more despite him than because of his precedent, all the philosophers seek to assassinate the old soul concept, under the guise of a critique of the subject and predicate concept, which means an attempt on the life of the basic presupposition of the Christian doctrine. Modern philosophy, being an epistemological skepticism, is covertly or overtly anti-Christian. Although, to say this for the benefit of more refined ears, by no means anti-religious. For formerly one believed in the soul as one believed in grammar and the grammatical subject. One said, I is the condition, think is the predicate and conditioned, thinking is an activity to which thought must supply a subject as cause. Then one tried with admirable perseverance and cunning to get out of this net, and asked whether the opposite might not be the case. Think the condition, I the conditioned, I in that case only a synthesis which is made by thinking. At bottom, Kant wanted to prove that starting from the subject could not be proved, nor could the object. The possibility of a merely apparent existence of the subject, the soul, in other words, may not always have remained strange to him. That thought, which as Vedanta philosophy existed once before on earth and exercised tremendous power. End quote. So much here, but I think in a way Nietzsche's saying something rather simple and elegant. So he's pointed out already how language does much of our thinking for us. How grammatical constructions in our thought lead us to think of the I, the ego consciousness, like to regard the fact that we have thoughts as evidence for some sort of noun, a thing with substance, right? Some sort of entity with being that does the thinking. You have a noun, that subject, that then does the verbing, right? But this is just a grammatical construction of thought, and he's pointing to Kant's synthesis, right? His Copernican revolution of the I becoming the thing which is a synthesis made by thinking, is I believe the way he puts it. Yeah, that's the way Nietzsche puts it here. I guess what's important to say, first of all, neither of these things are true. They're both just grammatical constructions, right? But to the extent that modern philosophy, to the extent that it is epistemologically skeptical and willing to critique the subject and predicate concept, this is what he starts out by saying in the beginning, to the extent that we do that, we are, he says, assassinate the old soul concept. But we're assassinating being, right? Which is Nietzsche's project, by the way. What's interesting here, Nietzsche, in a way, is giving us a key epistemologically to like his old Heraclitean paganism versus Christian epistemology, right? So becoming instead of being. He doesn't really talk about becoming here. He's just pointing out how being skeptical toward the ways in which our grammar creates being, creates thingness in the world, turns things into nouns, and even the way in which Kant tries to salvage logic, right, by sort of, it's a coming together of our perception and the external world in such a way that there are certain, what would you say, like presuppositions we have to make in order to perceive the world, not just merely sense the world, but to perceive and therefore understand the world as it exists. This isn't actually saving being, it's just another falsification of the world by means of language. And if we are truly to be epistemological skeptics and take that through to its ultimate conclusions and regard the constructions of language, the tyranny of words, as having no relationship with what we might call immediate reality that is not mediated by concepts, the reality that always exists in the present and which is always becoming and changing, in which we cannot really find the basis of any being, at least in terms of immediate sensation. There's only sensation and representation. There's only force and the reaction to it. Where would that lead us, right? And he suggests here, Kant is like a Vedantist in this way, right? So Vedanta is another philosophy with these mediating ideas about what the world is and our place in the world. You could say it denies the I, right? The ego, the self-consciousness as a separate thing, but then still affirms it as a phenomenon or a representation within the all. I know these will be unsatisfactory explanations for really diving into the nature of a lot of these philosophies, but if we spend all the podcast talking about Vedanta, we won't finish this division. So suffice to say, I think the important content of this passage is found in that idea of a radical epistemological skepticism towards our constructions of language, Nietzsche hinting here, that's anti-Christian necessarily, because it does away with being. And what do you have? And not trying to salvage it through Kant or Vedantism, this idea of being. You may not have an individual Atman, but there is a universal Atman, right, in Vedantism. Nietzsche's pointing to something else, which might be, you might say, is akin to the Atman of the Buddhists, but more precisely to Heraclitus and the flowing river. Okay. 55, continuing on. Quote, "There is a great ladder of religious cruelty with many rungs, but 3 of these are the most important. Once, one sacrificed human beings to one's God, perhaps precisely those whom one loved most. The sacrifices of the firstborn in all prehistoric religions belong here, as well as the sacrifice of the Emperor Tiberius in the Mithras Grotto on the Isle of Capri, that most gruesome of all Roman anachronisms. Then, during the moral epoch of mankind, one sacrificed to one's God one's own strongest instincts, one's nature. This festive joy lights up the cruel eyes of the ascetic, the anti-natural enthusiast. Finally, what remained to be sacrificed? At long last, did one not have to sacrifice for once whatever is comforting, holy, healing, all hope, all faith in hidden harmony, in future blisses and justices? Didn't one have to sacrifice God himself, and, from cruelty against oneself, worship the stone, stupidity, gravity, fate, the nothing? To sacrifice God for the nothing. This paradoxical mystery of the final cruelty was reserved for the generation that is now coming up. All of us already know something of this." End quote. And he leaves off with a dash there. So many things to say here. So this is the death of God at the end. And the death of God as not a violation of the pattern of religiosity, right? These rungs of cruelty, each taking the form of the demand of ourselves to make sacrifices. And I think that's a way of conceiving of religion that is quite in line with the understanding of religion in Christianity, going all the way back to the kind of pagan religion described by Fustel de Coulanges, and people like Jordan Peterson today describe religiosity as the willingness to make sacrifices for the sake of the future, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very good way to describe it. And notice the final sublation, the final overcoming of religion is not a refutation of this, it's its final realization. But let's notice too, the 3 rungs of cruelty. So cruelty, right? Nietzsche's written a fair bit on cruelty, and he thinks that cruelty in so many ways is a way of feeling your power. What will to power wants is to be expended, discharged onto the world. Force it has to be felt to be effective. Force is relational in that way. And so, in a way, it's a very dark idea, but it's one Nietzsche thinks we shouldn't look away from, as O'Brien tells Winston in 1984, that the way to experience one's power is to make another man suffer. Actually, he asks Winston, how does one feel their power? And Winston answers by making a man suffer. So this is how the religion establishes its power over the human mind, by making us all suffer, sacrificing a little something for the sake of this higher being, however we might conceive of it to be, or this higher moral duty. And the example Nietzsche gives is, for example, in Christianity, Abraham being told to sacrifice his only son. There's another passage. See, that one, Abraham gets out of it. An angel says, you don't actually have to do this. But there's another passage in the Bible where a child sacrifice does happen, and I forget, I want to say it's Joshua, but I might be wrong. So you can correct me here, where the general goes out on a campaign and says, God, just let me win this campaign and I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my door when I get home. And it's his daughter, of course, after he wins. And so he does sacrifice her. He goes through with that sacrifice. And then Nietzsche says the worst Roman anachronism was Emperor Tiberius being strangled, I believe, by his own head of his Praetorian Guard at the directive of Caligula, right? Nietzsche's describing this as like a sacrifice. And I have to say, I think his interpretation of this event is a bit funny, but what I will say about it is it's very informative that he calls this an anachronism, because the Romans certainly exist. The tenure of the Romans and their empire exists during the transition from what we might call this pre-moral age, this prehistoric age, to a moral age of mankind, because the Romans exist during the time in which virtue is now practiced widely. There are philosophies of virtue, and within the Roman Empire you have Stoicism, you have all these things rise up, and eventually Christianity itself, right? Which is perhaps the ultimate manifestation of this, of self-denial, withholding of the pleasures of the world, or even just fulfilling one's basic instincts from oneself as a way of taking power over oneself. The path of life, the ideal shown to us by the saint, the ascetic, the sage. There's already this has already transformed society by the time of Rome, or rather, we can say mankind moves from this superstitious sacrificing of literally living things, animals or human beings, for the sake of these personal deities, into this period of time where man, as a result of his enculturation, his needs as living as part of a being within the city, within a complex society, is forced to tyrannize over himself and his own drives. And as Nietzsche talks about in Genealogy of Morality, the way that we made people into moral beings, because obviously the first step to being a moral being is know thyself, right? You have to be self-reflective of your own actions in order to take control of your own actions, so to speak. And so that is introducing an intermediary force, right? Self-consciousness. And Nietzsche says that the way this is accomplished was by having a feeling suppressed by a thought, because in nature, the most natural thing is for any feeling, any impulse to be satisfied immediately. That's what the animal does. The human being makes a feeling suppressed by a thought. Well, how could you possibly do this? Through cruelty, right? By punishment. This is what happens. The community punishes the behaviors that have a negative consequence for the rest of the community. And there's no moral inculpatory element to this. It's, if anything, it's just that you're defective. You're bad because your actions are bad. It's not that you were a bad person who had bad intentions and you chose to do this bad thing. That would be more the Christian moral orientation. The prehistoric, what Nietzsche calls pre-moral, and this is in a section in Human All Too Human, it's also found later on in this very book, in the Natural History of Morals, if I recall correctly, which we will then, of course, get to later, simply by the consequences of your actions. That's how you were determined whether you were good or bad. And so this prehistoric, pre-moral orientation to the world then transitions to, over time, over long generations of the community exercising its cruelty on the individuals. What happens? The individuals develop the ability to suppress a feeling with a thought, and this is the thought of punishment, the thought of fear. What will the community do to me if I break this taboo? This taboo that was established for the sake of maintaining the harmony of the community or protecting the community. Oh, well, I'm going to get stoned to death, so I'd better not do that. And this, Nietzsche believes, is what created our capacity to remember at all, and therefore to have self-awareness, and therefore to have an intermediary consideration between the satisfaction of the feeling and our action to satisfy it, right? The need to satisfy it and our action to satisfy it. To intercede and bring that to mind, the cruelty, the potential cruelty of the community. This is what gives us self-reflection and self-awareness. And so then, as we move beyond sacrificing natural beings, either because our beliefs simply move beyond that kind of superstition, or because of the power and the pleasure that comes with the ability for self-tyranny that the priest experiences and teaches the community to experience, the ascetic model of mankind shows us, and with the figures like such as Socrates, who lives for virtue, who knows himself, who seeks the truth in order to do the good. This is when we get the moral epoch of mankind that we're still living in today, right? We're in that second phase. Instead, we sacrifice to one's God, one's own strongest instincts, one's nature. This is what we do. We sacrifice nature to the demands of civilization. And this festive joy lights up the cruel eyes of the ascetic, the anti-natural enthusiast, for all the reasons that we talked about before. This is the person whose will to power has manifest in being anti-natural. And this is sort of like his festival on earth, is all mankind imitating his mode of psychological being, of denying himself what is natural in order to feel that power and tyranny over himself. But this final phase is the post-moral or extra-moral age of mankind. Again, this three-step progression appears in Human All Too Human and elsewhere in this text, but it is mirrored here with the effect that this has on religion, right? That these are not separate things, this moral development of mankind and our metaphysical ideas. They go hand in hand. And so this final sacrifice and renunciation is the sacrifice and renunciation of the comforts, the metaphysical comforts and pleasures promised by God, the rewarder, God the redeemer, God the just, right? To live without those things. This is the philosophy of Schopenhauer. This is asceticism taken through to its ultimate conclusions. The realization that the holy life leads to nothingness and the total repudiation of the world and of existence and of being. This idea of being that we've created through religion, right? And eventually it ends with the Schopenhauerian or the Vedantist or the Buddhist or the Epicurean leaving the world entirely and without even any expectation of divine reward or comfort in exchange for this. Even that has been sacrificed, and we enter the more honest and gloomy 19th century, and of course then the death of God. And Nietzsche makes some cryptic comments at the end there, but that make perfect sense in light of that idea that the death of God is a thing still yet to be perceived, though there are some of us around who see this coming, who see this final renunciation coming. And so with that, we'll move on to number 56. Quote, "Whoever has endeavored with some enigmatic longing, as I have, to think pessimism through to its depths, and to liberate it from the half-Christian, half-German narrowness and simplicity in which it has finally presented itself to our century, namely in the form of Schopenhauer's philosophy, whoever has really, with an Asiatic and super-Asiatic eye, looked down into the most world-denying of all possible ways of thinking, beyond good and evil no longer, like the Buddha and Schopenhauer, under the spell and delusion of morality, may just thereby, without really meaning to do so, have opened his eyes to the opposite ideal. The ideal of the most high-spirited, alive, most affirming human being who has not only come to terms and learned to get along with whatever was and is, but who wants to have what was and is repeated into all eternity, shouting insatiably da capo, not only to himself, but to the whole play and spectacle, and not only to a spectacle, but at bottom to him who needs precisely this spectacle, and who makes it necessary because again and again he needs himself and makes himself necessary." What? Wouldn't this be circulus viciosus Deus? End quote. And that means a vicious circle made God, or God is a vicious circle. Okay. So, given the explication we just did of the previous section, I think this one is actually, at the beginning of it, should be quite clear. And it's very logical. Anyone who tells you that these sections are not arranged in a structured way and that you can read any aphorism in any order, that may be true like in the next section, right? The epigrams and aphorisms section, but not in these. For the most part, Nietzsche has actually a very intelligent and well thought out way of structuring his work. So right after that, where we sort of the sacrifice, right, and renunciation of the metaphysical comforts of religion leads you to the place of Buddha and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche brings them up by name in the very next section. And basically, this post-moral age is the dawning of this complete, absolute pessimism. And Nietzsche is giving us then the story of what he's done, which shouldn't surprise us by now, right? That because he says He's opened his eyes to the opposite ideal. But as we all know from reading Nietzsche, it's not actually opposite in the way of an essential category difference, right, of, say, optimism versus pessimism. Because Nietzsche doesn't consider himself an optimist, he considers himself a pessimist of strength. So it's through that pessimism that Nietzsche has, by gradations, reached something which now appears as the opposite ideal, which is that having had gotten rid of all of those metaphysical comforts and moral ideas, we then sublate that pessimism, that world denial that motivated the very desire, that search for the dispassionate, detached truth, right? The truth beyond any human interest. We followed that through to its ultimate conclusions and have even assassinated being itself, right? And so now the need for that pessimism has been overcome, or the need from that, because we might say it's still pessimistic. We're still affirming the world as suffering, right? A painful world, a samsaric world. But the rejection of this has been sublated by rejecting all of the dogmas and doctrines of metaphysics and morality as completely as they can possibly be rejected. And then what we get is only becoming, and then perceiving the reality as only becoming, as pure impermanence and samsara. We may then shout to it, de capo, for all eternity. Again, right? From the beginning, that's what de capo means. Let's take that again from the start of the tune, right? This is eternal return. This is Nietzsche basically, again, giving us the message of Zarathustra, but in a not in an allegorical, poetic form, but in a philosophical form, saying that it is through the total embrace of this pessimism that we can even then move beyond pessimism itself. Or I should stop saying pessimism. That the pessimism of Schopenhauer and the Buddha ends in nihilism, and we can sublate that into anti-nihilism. Or maybe we could say, turn it from a passive nihilism into an active nihilism, which then becomes creative. And Nietzsche's creative response is the eternal return idea, to suggest our justification, redemption, or elevation of the world is to affirm it into eternity. Okay, 57, quote, "With the strength of his spiritual eye and insight grows distance, and, as it were, the space around man. His world becomes more profound. Ever new stars, ever new riddles and images become visible to him. Perhaps everything on which the spirit's eye had exercised its acuteness and thoughtfulness was nothing but an occasion for this exercise, a playful matter, something for children and those who are childish. Perhaps the day will come when the most solemn concepts which have caused the most fights and suffering, the concepts God and Sen, will seem no more important to us than a child's toy and a child's pain seem to an old man. And perhaps the old man will then be in need of another toy and another pain, still child enough, an eternal child," end quote. So what did we just say about Thus Spoke Zarathustra? Nietzsche, he doesn't tell us anything about this man. He just says, he starts talking in the third person about somebody. But we can glean, again, in context from the previous sections of the text, that he's talking about this development, this overcoming of previous metaphysical or moral orientations until it opens up, until even the pessimism and the nihilism that this has led to opens up into an anti-nihilism and a creativity. And this is, in many ways, Nietzsche giving us in philosophical form in this very brief section, the whole camel, lion, and child analogy from Zarathustra's prologue. The important bit not being so much the beginnings of that metaphor as it is the child as the symbol of innocent creativity, and God and Sen. These were just a child's toy. No more important than a child's pain seems to an old man. You don't nurse bitterness over the time you fell down and skinned your knee when you were 5, right? And your child's toys, the things that were of the supreme interest to you, are of no more interest to you. Perhaps this will be what God and sin are to us, because these were just inventions of men. They were another child's toy, another child's pain, another creation. Maybe we could create something else, something new. That this is, again, to embody the spirit of the innocent creative child, to be willing to create something new, to no longer be bound. That's actually, it sounds like a very, when I say it out loud like that, almost like a trite observation, but really to be done with the concepts of God, of a personal creator and judge and controller of the universe, and sin, of a moral duty and the potential that by violating that duty, you are in some way like staining yourself or your soul, or do some sort of punishment or something like that. To really have done with those concepts as if they were child's toys or the child's pain of yesteryear, that is a very tall order. Most people don't do it. And so you can't even get to the phase of being a creative child yourself, because, you're still playing with the childish things of earlier ages, the creativity of previous societies and civilizations that's still living rent-free in your head. But, what is it? That true maturity is a passage from the Bible, that when I was a grown man, I put away childish things. So that's what Nietzsche is calling us to do. 58, quote, "Has it ever been really noted to what extent a genuinely religious life, both its microscopic favorite occupation of self-examination and that tender composure which calls itself prayer, and his continual readiness for the coming of God, requires a leisure class, or half-leisure, I mean leisure with a good conscience, from way back, by blood, to which the aristocratic feeling that work disgraces is not altogether alien, the feeling that it makes soul and body common, and that consequently our modern, noisy, time-consuming industriousness, proud of itself, stupidly proud, educates and prepares people more than anything else does precisely for unbelief. Among those, for example, who now live in Germany at a distance from religion, I find people whose free thinking is of diverse types and origins, but above all a majority of those in whom industriousness has, from generation unto generation, dissolved the religious instincts, so they no longer even know what religions are good for, and merely register their presence in the world with a kind of dumb amazement. They feel abundantly committed, these good people, whether to their business or to their pleasures, not to speak of the fatherland, and the newspapers and family obligations. It seems that they simply have no time left for religion, the more so because it remains unclear to them whether it involves another business or another pleasure. For it is not possible, they say to themselves, that one goes to church merely to dampen one's good spirits. They are not enemies of religious customs. When participation in such customs is required in certain cases, by the state, for example, they do what is required, as one does so many things, with a patient and modest seriousness and without much curiosity and discomfort. They simply live too much apart and outside to feel any need for any pro and con in such matters." End quote. So we might notice at the beginning that Nietzsche is pointing out that there is something aristocratic about the ascetic way of life, and that they remove themselves from the world of work and enter a lifestyle of what he calls true leisure, or at least half leisure. And that Nietzsche thinks that a life of work or labor spoils your ability for true contemplation, and that even if the ascetics themselves didn't always come from an aristocratic background, that's in a way what the monastery simulates to some extent. In the East, the Buddhist monks are not allowed to have money or work occupations, and so even though they do beg for their food, right? This is better than lowering themselves by working for a living, right? They're still subsisting off of the charity of others, and just allowed to simply contemplate and meditate all day. And they're, eating only the simplest food that is given to them is not, a downside. That's part of the way of life. That's part of what's demanded by the conquering of their own inner nature. But then Nietzsche starts talking about the modern person who's given up on religion, and it's almost like they don't have time for religion anymore. It's not because they've contemplated deeply about these things, as the priest or ascetic has. It's just that it's been sort of squeezed out of their life, and he says that they don't really know whether church is supposed to be a business or a pleasure, And, he's talking about like the industrious, practical person, the subjects that's been shaped by the economic developments that are leading into industrial capitalism, right? No longer really comprehends religion. And I think this critique is actually very spot on for the role that religion plays in a lot of people's lives, where it's sort of like relegated to a smaller and smaller piece that they just have less and less time for. And they don't have time to contemplate the deep issues. They're sort of being transformed into a cog in this machine, into this mechanistic system of civilization, just as we now have a mechanistic metaphysics. And the religion doesn't really fit into that very well. And I'm going to skip over reading the next paragraph, but he talks about how the scholars engage with religion, and how the German university scholars are sort of like a reflection of this, new industrious way of life, we might call it. And that the scholar, what does he say? I'll just read a little snippet from the end. He says, the practical indifference toward religious matters into which he has been born and brought up is generally sublimated in him into caution and cleanliness that shun contact with religious men and matters. He's talking about the scholar here. And it may be precisely the depth of his tolerance and humanity that bids him dodge the subtle distress involved in tolerance. Okay, so with that being said, we'll look at the end of this section where Nietzsche says, quote, every age has its own divine type of naivete for whose invention other ages may envy it. And how much naivete, venerable, childlike, and boundlessly clumsy naivete, lies in the scholar's faith in his superiority, and the good conscience of his tolerance, and the unsuspecting simple certainty with which his instinct treats the religious man as an inferior and lower type that he has outgrown, leaving it behind, beneath him, that presumptuous little dwarf and rabble man, the assiduous and speedy head and handiworker of ideas, of modern ideas, end quote. And so we can see the undertone there, that Nietzsche is like him, you like the modern scholar, that you are presumptuous little dwarf. So this is a small-souled person, right? This is a momentary person, a person shaped by the newspapers and obsession with the current trends and events. And, he says a speedy head and handiworker of ideas and of modern ideas, the man of his time, and he's the rabble man. He's the industrious cog in the machine like everyone else. That's what the modern scholar is, and Nietzsche would tell you, and I know because I used to be one of them, right? And his rejection of religion, ironically, comes not from the fact that the scholar has thought very deeply, contemplated the religious matters and the spiritual matters and the metaphysics very deeply and very personally, with the kind of solitude that one could have as part of an ascetic class. Because remember, one of the things that's very interesting that Nietzsche points out is that you have sort of like a knightly fighting aristocracy. That's like the natural, original aristocracy. The priesthood creates a counter aristocracy, right? It's the aristocracy of the slave classes in a way. But that still makes them more aristocratic, right, than the modern person who is just this cog in the machine, or who is doesn't have the 2/3 of his day to himself that perhaps the ascetic or the priest would, right? That will allow him to contemplate and touch the deep matters. This is all simply to say, in the same way that the common person just doesn't have time for religion anymore, the scholar feels like he doesn't have time for, I don't have time for all those backwards superstitions. I don't have time for these ideas about universal dogmatic truths. I'm just tolerant, right? It's another way in which the common modern idea of free thinking might be mistaken for Nietzsche's free-spiritedness, but is actually very different, because this is a sort of dismissal and unwillingness to penetrate into the depths, to discover those insights, like the sort of the opposite natures, the supposedly good and bad natures succeeding one another within the figure of the saint, and what this means psychologically, and how it might, or treating religion as a physiological phenomenon, and looking at the benefits also of religion and how it has like provided these things, these ideals for mankind that they haven't been able to quite find anywhere else. These deeper considerations are very far from the scholar. And so the person that we might think would be sort of just a mystical idiot, right? An empty-headed zealot who, gets his whole ideology from a book, the saint, right? He's actually the one who's had the leisure to think more comprehensively about religion and metaphysics, whereas the scholar doesn't have time to think about these things and keeps it at arm's length and at a distance and treats it as something uncleanly and beneath him. And so it's like his type of quote-unquote free thinking is in fact nothing of the kind. The actual freedom to think very deeply exists within the saint and not within the scholar. And the scholar, the opposite case, but he's the one who thinks himself superior. These religious types, and Nietzsche's implying that this is absurd. He's not superior. He's implying the old sort of pseudo-aristocratic, pseudo-leisurely, saintly class is more admirable or respectable than this modern, scholarly cog in the machine, the scholarly drone droning away at his one area of technical skill, right? Remember all the comments Nietzsche made about scholars at the beginning of the book. Okay, so I think we can move on. It's a fascinating critique, actually, in terms of, the way the God is dead thing is often misrepresented by people sort of claiming that Nietzsche is just trying to saying we need to return to traditional values so that this would be better than the coming nihilism, right? They should really look up Beyond Good and Evil, number 58, if they want a much better critique of like the rationalist, atheistic, worldview overtaking the religious dogmatic worldview, and why this is actually, Nietzsche does actually denigrate that in this passage and suggests that the older moral orientation, at least, was more admirable. Now, obviously, in the broader context of his ideas, he doesn't believe the saint is the final form, right? He thinks we need to overcome the saint, but we're not overcoming the saint with the modern scholar or the modern man, the industrial man, right? Okay, 59, let's move on. Quote, "Anyone who has looked deeply into the world may guess how much wisdom lies in the superficiality of men. The instinct that preserves them teaches them to be flighty, light, and false. Here and there one encounters an impassioned and exaggerated worship of pure forms among both philosophers and artists. Let nobody doubt that whoever stands that much in need of the cult of surfaces must at some time have reached beneath them with disastrous results. Perhaps there even exists an order of rank among these burnt children, these born artists who can find the enjoyment of life only in the intention of falsifying its image, as it were in a long-winded revenge on life. The degree to which life has been spoiled for them might be inferred from the degree to which they wish to see its image falsified, thinned down, transcendentalized, deified. The homines religiosi might be included among artists as their highest rank." End quote. So, remember what Nietzsche says in Division 2 of the text. The strength of a soul might be measured in the degree it doesn't need the truth, watered down, falsified, sweetened for them, muffled, blunted. Various ways you can translate it. What is he saying here? There are those who can find enjoyment in life only in falsifying its image. And this is because of the degree to which life has been spoiled for them. And that's how we can see, it's like the strength of a soul measured to the degree to how much they can take the truth in its pure, raw, unadulterated form. And the more that it has to be thinned down and falsified, the more life has been spoiled for them. So the more that they've failed to overcome the challenges of their life, have been unable to get what they want, have had their desires or their will frustrated, life has disappointed them. And the image of life then has to be transcendentalized and deified. So we're getting a picture of the religious need. What is religious? The essence of religiosity, the religious pathology, as again coming from the physiology, or not, if not physiology proper, from the physiological or physical reality of someone's life and whether they've actually been successful in manifesting their will in the world, right? Whether they've been a success or a failure. It's not just simply as easy, especially in modern times, like, are they a strong, domineering, powerful life form? Because people's will is directed at all sorts of different things that aren't necessarily involved just in physical combat. We're not chimpanzees anymore. We live in these complex civilizations. We have to reckon with the fact that we are in that moral age. We've gone through the pre-moral and then the moral age, and we're on the cusp of this post-moral age. We have all of that, inheritance going on in our psychology. So our will can be aimed at all sorts of different things. And to the extent that someone is successful in overcoming the challenges to manifesting their will, that is the degree to which they will not need this religious neurosis. So the religious neurosis or pathology is growing to the extent that somebody is needing to falsify the world to in some way comfort themselves. And the very interesting thing is the link between the religious type and the artist in this passage. He says they are born artists who basically falsify the image of reality, and that there may be even an order of rank among them, right? There are gradations to which they need to have reality falsified. That's the degree to which they've essentially been failures in life, right? In the physical competition or competition in actual reality in the world. And what does he say? There's something, the interesting turn here, right? Or I guess it's not a turn, it's the caveat he gives us at the beginning that perhaps much wisdom lies in the superficiality of men, that it's an instinct that preserves them, that teaches them to be flighty, light, and false. And so, because again, to go back to the considerations at the beginning of the book, suppose the truth is actually dangerous. Suppose this assassination of being and the perception of the world is purely samsaric, purely impermanent, no comfort, nowhere to rest your feet on, right? No firm ground to stand upon. Suppose that is, what would you say? Suppose that would destroy you. It would destroy your ability to will in the world. It would perhaps direct your will towards nothing entirely, as Schopenhauer's was, or just make you completely passively nihilistic and just give in to hedonism or whatever. And so there may be people who are actually in need of what Nietzsche calls the cult of surfaces. It's funny because he references pure forms among philosophers, right? The philosopher is also a type of artist. It's like all of these mental ideations and intermediary considerations for what the world is, not just our perception of the world, but the way that we interpret the world. This is an artistic act, and this is something that he's sort of brought up from the beginning of the text. And so this artistic act might be because we need the cult of surfaces to live. We need to falsify the appearance because it's only a moral prejudice that the truth be worth more than mere appearances, right? So make the appearances something by which you can live. That's the entire purpose of these appearances in the first place. And so the worship of pure forms, Plato's world of ideas, which is supposed to be the intelligible world beyond appearance, was just another cult of surfaces that an artist, Plato, created by which man could then live, right? And why would Plato have had need of this? Well, as we talked about last season, Plato is this frustrated utopian. He's still a very accomplished man in many ways, but his ideals are not being realized in the practical political sense, right? And so he might need to falsify the world as this place where, the wisdom of the philosophers is never understood by the wayward, passionate rabble who run society. Or, the philosopher is always unfairly sort of castigated and cast out from the community. But if they would only listen to me, we could have a, utopian society, right? We could live by true virtue. So let's carry on with the passage. Nietzsche continues, quote, "It is the profound suspicious fear of an incurable pessimism that forces whole millennia to bury their teeth in and cling to a religious interpretation of existence. The fear of that instinct which senses that one might get a hold of the truth too soon, before man has become strong enough, hard enough, artist enough. Piety, the life in God, seen in this way, would appear as the subtlest and final offspring of the fear of the truth. As an artist's worship and intoxication before the most consistent of all falsifications, as the will to the inversion of truth, to untruth at any price. It may be that until now there has been no more potent means for beautifying man himself than piety. It can turn man into so much art, surface, play of colors, graciousness, that his sight no longer makes one suffer." And I think, end quote, I think given the explanation I gave for the cutting in the middle of the passage, that should all be relatively clear that this may be that piety, it might be this profound and beautiful falsification of man. This is one of the ways that the religious mindset or the religious mood, the religious sentimentality has endured. This fear, this primordial fear of the truth, that final fear that it may be actually impossible for human beings to get over. Nietzsche, I think, hopes that maybe one day it would be possible. But, that it's not a strike against this view of mankind that it dwells within the superficial and just the surface world, the world of art and appearances, right? That's not what might be wrong with piety in Nietzsche's view. In many ways, he's pointing out how this has made mankind beautiful, how this has made life worth living. It's justified, elevated, or redeemed life, mere appearances. That's in many ways the task of the artist, whether he is a true artist in the strict sense or the philosopher or theologian, is to falsify life. All right, so the next passage is 60. It's one of my favorites. Quote, "To love man for God's sake, that has so far been the noblest and most remote feeling attained among men. That the love of man is just one more stupidity and brutishness if there is no ulterior intent to sanctify it. That the inclination to such love of man must receive its measure, its subtlety, its grain of salt and dash of ambergris from some higher inclination. Whoever the human being may have been who first felt and experienced this, however much his tongue may have stumbled as it tried to express such delicatesse, let him remain holy and venerable for us for all time as the human being who has flown highest yet and gone astray most beautifully." End quote. I want to point something out about the metaphor Nietzsche is using, because he used the term like flighty, false, right, in the last passage. What is Nietzsche's philosophy? Well, one of the ways we've described it as a worldly philosophy, a philosophy of keeping your feet planted firmly on the ground. And so when he talks about the person, whoever came up with the idea of loving man for God's sake, whatever mystic or sage or saint first uttered this idea, he has flown the highest yet and gone astray most beautifully. And why is this? Because there is truth to the idea that we might call it an honest and gloomy 19th century truth, a cynical truth, but perhaps some measure of truth nonetheless, to the idea that the love of man, of all mankind, is just one more stupidity and brutishness if there is no ulterior intent to sanctify it. And what we mean by that is, if all our impulses are stupidity and brutishness, which is a case that Nietzsche has been somewhat putting forward, if all our drives come from this non-rational place, this unconscious place, if everything that we consider sacred, graceful, beautiful, so on and so forth, are actually transfigurations and manifestations of these very base, we might say dumb or blind physiological impulses and instincts, that being the case, the love of all mankind is yet another such thing. However beautiful we may find this, falsification of the world, it comes out of yet another one of these just dumb instincts, like all things human, right? It's unremarkable in that sense. To sanctify that feeling, though, to say, no, there is actually a higher being that is calling us to love all mankind, to love all men as one's brother. This is the message of Christianity, right? Of the message of Jesus, that, your God the Father calls you to love all men as brothers, right? Brothers in Christ, maybe. We might say there's still a distinction between the non-believers and believers, but it's not, there's no more like racial distinctions of the chosen people, and you're still expected to turn the other cheek toward your adversary, that there is like a value to every human being. But you are actually supposed to love one's enemy, just as you love one's neighbor. You're commanded to love. Very strange idea when we really think about it. You're commanded to love mankind for the sake of God. And there may be times when there's someone, love your enemy. Imagine all the times when that commandment might be quite impossible, if not for the idea that it is sanctified by a higher, all-powerful, all-just, all-moral being that you have to obey, and that it is your obligation to do so. And we might wonder, just as a bit of speculation, to what degree is it possible, and have there been what might we say, almost like beautiful Herculean tasks of finding the capacity to love even the most brutal, terrible people that have occurred only because of the idea that we are called to love man for God's sake. Is it possible that this like alchemy of the soul has actually happened because of this false appearance on the world? And so but what would we say? Nietzsche respects this in some way because it's the understanding that to love all of mankind without that element would be quite impossible. And in fact, it wouldn't even be something that we should laud or find admirable, because it's just another bit of brutishness driven by blind instinct. If we introduce that sanctifying element, it becomes possible, and these amazing things become possible. The amazing ability of somebody like, to bring it back to an example from the beginning, Angulimala or St. Paul having like a complete character transformation and going from a murderer to a pacifist and, someone who would serve the moral interest of the community. So this is I think, a very interesting passage for those reasons, that it points to something that Christianity gave us through its system of ideals that we can't necessarily find in a secular world, which might point to the fact that if God truly is dead, we have to get rid of this idea of like loving mankind, and that outside of like an immediate, like the felt idea of bringing that thought to your mind, because we might say that the figure of God as a divine ruler comes out of this tradition of the community visiting its cruelty on the individuals in order to shape their conscience, and that in the way that we have a religious conscience when we're living within a religious like collective net of consciousness, and the idea that God is constantly watching and judging you, right? Outside of somebody who literally forces himself in the moment to try and love somebody else out of that obligation to God, right? Is it really possible to love all of mankind outside of those individual instances where you are called upon to do that and have to do it out of a moral duty? Can we do it just as it becomes an abstract, right? It becomes an abstraction that I love all of mankind outside of that religious sacralization of that idea, because it's just sort of like based on what? Like a Peter Singer style utilitarianism, like a series of rational considerations that leads you to think that it would be a good thing to do to love all mankind. But how do you do that practically speaking, right? The Christian had the practical example of like turning the other cheek. And maybe that is still possible. I think Nietzsche would just simply say, now, in light of the fact that we understand that as just a bit more stupidity and brutishness, the person who turns the other cheek, we know that that's actually coming from their own, what might we say, physiological instincts. Their own inability to resist evil is actually what motivates. That is the kind of person who will adopt the morality of resist not evil. So I don't know. I think this is all pretty clear. I think we can move on. Okay, let's go to 61. And this is a long section, as is 62. These are the last two sections of part 3. And so I'll read as much as I can before I feel I have to break into the passage. 61, quote, "The philosopher as we understand him, we free spirits, as the man of the most comprehensive responsibility, who has the conscience for the overall development of man. This philosopher will make use of religions for his project of cultivation and education, just as he will make use of whatever political and economic states are at hand. The selective and cultivating influence, always destructive as well as creative and form-giving, which can be exerted with the help of religions, is always multiple and different according to the sort of human beings who are placed under its spell and protection. For the strong and independent who are prepared and predestined to command, and in whom the reason and art of a governing race become incarnate, religion is one more means for overcoming resistances, for the ability to rule, as a bond that unites rulers and subjects and betrays and delivers the consciences of the latter, that which is most concealed and intimate and would like to elude obedience to the former. And if a few individuals of such noble descent are inclined through lofty spirituality to prefer a more withdrawn and contemplative life and reserve for themselves only the most subtle type of rule over selected disciples or brothers in some order, then religion can even be used as a means for obtaining peace from the noise and exertion of cruder forms of government, and purity from the necessary dirt of all politics. That is how the Brahmins, for example, understood things. By means of a religious organization, they gave themselves the power of nominating the kings of the people, while they themselves kept and felt apart and outside, as men of higher and supra-royal tasks. End quote. So it's not the first time that Nietzsche gives praise to the caste system of India. He also does so in his notes. But, we can leave the problematical aspects of that aside and just look at the fact that what he's saying is that the people who are going to be running your society, let's look at it in practical utilitarian terms. You want the people who are going to be running your society to be insulated, at least in some way, from what he calls the necessary dirt of all politics. And while we have a counter inclination towards that kind of thing today with democracy, we think they need to be accountable, they need to be attuned to the will of the people, I think there is some wisdom to the idea that having them be lofty and removed keeps them less corruptible. Makes it to where, especially if you have the Brahmins are a great example, and it's even hard to imagine this outside of a theocracy today, where you have a priestly caste who isn't in pursuit of material wealth or well-being in that manner, right? And nominates the king, but then doesn't really take a hands-on approach with it. That in a way they become sort of beyond, they conceive of themselves as having a task which is beyond the task of the royalty, of the kings of the society. More importantly, Nietzsche is giving religion its due in this passage. He's doing it in a very Machiavellian way, right? That many people might find disturbing, where he's saying, well, the people might need religion and the ruler of society should use that. And that aristocratic element is certainly there, of using religion to control people. But what he's saying about religion is actually to give it its due in terms of pragmatic terms for all the things that we've talked about before, of the things that it can give to the individual in terms of directing their conscience in a certain way, or comforting them in a certain way, or, just aspects of religion that aren't easily gotten from outside of that sphere. And that you can, through religion, that perhaps more importantly, religion is sort of like a way of managing the psyche, or of manipulating the psyche, if we want to be more cynical about it. That religion can transmute the inner states, the inner emotional content of the community, and shape and redirect the way that the community feels about certain things. And we talked about this in past episodes. In Season 2, the episode about the artist and the episode about the saint. So let's continue. Quote, meanwhile, religion also gives to some of the ruled the instruction and opportunity to prepare themselves for future ruling and obeying, those slowly ascending classes in which, thanks to fortunate marital customs, the strength and joy of the will to self-control is ever growing. Receive enough nudges and temptations from religion to walk the paths to higher spirituality, to test the feelings of great self-overcoming, of silence and solitude. Asceticism and Puritanism are almost indispensable means for educating and ennobling a race that wishes to become master over its origins among the rabble, and that works its way up toward future rule. End quote. This is a very important point, actually. Still aristocratic and elitist, but notice what it is. It's meritocratic. And I almost hate to use that word, because when we think of meritocracy, we think about it in the sense of industrial, capitalist, business-oriented modern society that Nietzsche, as you can tell from the passages earlier, kind of has disdain for in comparison to, for example, the life of the ascetic. That the graduation from medieval lord and bondsman, of serf and feudal lord, the graduation of that to mercantile capitalism and cosmopolitanism, the Marxists view that as moving to a higher, state of human freedom that makes possible than socialism. Nietzsche sees that as a very, so again, Nietzsche's not going to look at that as this was so terrible and we need to go back, but he sees how it was calamitous to humankind in a way, that it made us momentary, cheap, superficial, mass-produced individuals. And the function of religion in society, he's pointing to it here, or some sort of, code of moral duty, some sort of, metaphysical or moral understanding allows people to walk paths to higher spirituality, and to, even those who have their origins among the rabble, they can work their way up toward future rules. So Nietzsche has no problem with this fluidity between classes. He seems to think that this is a good thing. So to continue, quote, "To ordinary human beings, finally, the vast majority who exist for service and the general advantage, and who may exist only for that, religion gives an inestimable contentment with their situation and type, manifold peace of the heart, and ennobling of obedience, one further happiness and sorrow with their peers, and something transfiguring and beautifying, something of a justification for the whole everyday character, the whole lowliness, the whole half-brutish poverty of their souls. Religion and religious significance spread the splendor of the sun over such ever-toiling human beings and make their own sight tolerable to them. Religion has the same effect which an Epicurean philosophy has on sufferers of a higher rank. It is refreshing, refining, makes, as it were, the most of suffering, and in the end even sanctifies and justifies. Perhaps nothing in Christianity or Buddhism is as venerable as their art of teaching even the lowliest how to place themselves through piety in an illusory higher order of things, and thus to maintain their contentment with the real order, in which their life is hard enough, and precisely this hardness is necessary." End quote. So, given everything we've talked about, fairly self-explanatory. The thing that might confuse some people is that Nietzsche's saying this is a good thing, but he's saying it's a good thing for the people who have to be, what does he say specifically here? The vast majority who exist for service and the general advantage, and who may exist only for that. So what he's pointing to is this hard truth that for society and civilization, this is the big scary thing in Nietzsche that no one likes to confront. For society and civilization to exist, certain people have to be made into instruments. They have to live for the benefit of the general good in service to society. And he's saying, and they're not allowed to be anything other than that. And what he means by that is that they simply don't have the capacity. He's permitting there are people among the common folk, we might say, or people who are just not born aristocrats, who are born into this life of toil and labor, who might reach a point where they're destined for future rule. That's not impossible. That can happen. But it's not the majority of them. And because of Nietzsche's sort of fatalistic approach to life, his rejection of free will, his belief in people as natural beings, it's not that he thinks like they have the free will to just buckle down and work hard or be creative entrepreneurs if they really wanted to, right? He thinks, no, they're basically born slaves. They might be wage slaves in the modern sense, but their whole life will be used instrumentally for tasks higher than those of their own individual making, right? And what religion did was it comforted them in this and created an illusory higher order of things. So an order of piety, right? To where, blessed are the poor and the downtrodden, that the meek shall inherit the earth, right? They're actually higher up above it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than to thread a camel through the eye of the needle. They're higher up than the rich people or the powerful people who dominate them. And this was very useful for basically Nietzsche's just saying religion is the opiate of the masses, right? And you remove that, what do you get? Well, you get Marxism. You get people basically saying, I don't want to be a slave or an instrument of society. We need to restructure society so that all are equal. Nietzsche's problem with this is that it's actually functionally impossible. He doesn't think that can happen. What it will actually do, the more you democratize and egalitarianize society, is lead to the downfall of society, because to Nietzsche, civilization is so indelibly premised on this idea of domination and exploitation that the more you break that down, the less of a society you have, in some sense. It really is that brutal. But religion allowed that to sort of to reach an equilibrium and to endure in some way. And so again, much better passage for getting across what Nietzsche believes about, religion and the usefulness of religion, and sort of, not, if not lamenting, pointing out the ways in which getting rid of religion is dangerous. I think the reason why, again, I have to bring him up so much, but it's just like he's so useful as an example. The Jordan Petersons of the world probably don't want to talk about the passage as much because Nietzsche does basically say religion is the opiate of the masses, right? So even though it is a passage praising the usefulness of religion, it's the usefulness in keeping people as instruments, as objects, which a lot of the types like Jordan Peterson don't want to acknowledge that that's the reality of modern industrial capitalism. They basically want to say, like, no, people are all free individuals who are sovereign and they all have value, and that's actually true, and our society actually does that, and they actually can succeed if they try hard. Or maybe he doesn't. I guess he does acknowledge like the IQ literature and sees intelligence as this like really predictive quality of human life, right? That's sort of like an immutable characteristic. So I don't know. But the point being, it's this kind of passage actually presents a lot of problems for people who are, wanting to affirm the moral, virtue of our society as it is now, right? Nietzsche thinks we should be anti-revolutionary, but it's not because he thinks our society currently is moral. It's just that it can't be any other way. And you're going to just create a different hierarchy of domination in a new society after all the anarchy and bloodletting and fire and chaos of the downfall of the old one. So now we're going to look at the last passage of What is Religious. This is number 62, and the conclusion of Nietzsche's considerations about the religious pathology, the religious state of mind that, he's looked at so many different aspects of it, and he's treated it, I think, rather fairly. So these are his final considerations. Quote, "In the end, to be sure, to present the other side of the account of these religions too, and to expose their uncanny dangerousness, one always pays dearly and terribly when religions do not want to be a means of education and cultivation in the philosopher's hand, but insist on having their own sovereign way, when they themselves want to be the ultimate ends and not means among other means." End quote. So I'm cutting in here because I think that's very instructive in the way Nietzsche puts it. He's willing to use religion as a means. His problem is when religion becomes an ends, and that is exactly how the types like Jordan Peterson view religion, right? Because meaning to them is the ultimate ends, some sort of transcendental higher meaning for life, and that's what religion gives you. And so pursuing the religious life is the ends, and that ultimately is world-denying in Nietzsche's view because of the morality of the ascetic and the saint and what it means to pursue the religious life through to its ends. So if we keep doing that, we're just going to keep degenerating into nihilism in Nietzsche's view, because that ends in the Schopenhauerian Buddhist sacrifice of everything and pursuit of nothingness, right? The only way in Nietzsche's view is to affect this revaluation of values and to look at that as the opportunity to affirm life eternally. Okay, which we've already gone over. So back to the passage. Quote, "There is among men, as in every other animal species, an excess of failures, of the sick, degenerating, infirm, who suffer necessarily. The successful cases are, among men too, always the exception, and in view of the fact that man is the as yet undetermined animal, the rare exception. But still worse, the higher the type of man that a man represents, the greater the improbability that he will turn out well. The accidental, the law of absurdity, and the whole economy of mankind manifests itself most horribly in its destructive effect on the higher men, whose complicated conditions of life can only be calculated with great subtlety and difficulty." End quote. And so again, another aspect of Zarathustra he's getting across here, right? Nietzsche has this sort of pity for the higher man, and it's the last thing that Zarathustra has to get over, right? That's his last challenge to overcome, because the result of this thousands of years of enculturation and inculcation of the moral way of viewing the world based on this ascetic morality has been to basically root out the exceptional person who stands outside of the morality of the collective. Okay, let's continue. Quote, "What then is the attitude of the above-mentioned two greatest religions toward this excess of cases that did not turn out right? They seek to preserve alive whatever can possibly be preserved. Indeed, as a matter of principle, they side with these cases as religions for sufferers. They agree with all those who suffer life like a sickness and would like to make sure that every other feeling about life should be considered false and should become impossible. End quote. And so I want to point out something I actually didn't make clear. So he's saying the higher type of individuals, the more will to power, right, that is manifest in an individual, the less likely that they'll turn out well. Why? Because they're more exceptional and more at odds with the community. So it's more likely that they will fail in manifesting their will to power, the more particular and extraordinary they are. But what happens? These two greatest religions, Buddhism and Christianity, basically, who he's speaking of, what do? Well, they side with them because these men suffer greatly, and these are the religions for sufferers. And so there's something very interesting in the way Nietzsche thinks these religious ideas acquired their greatest power among human beings, or perhaps had their greatest bursts of creative power. And he talks about this in The Antichrist, that where Christianity really found fertile ground was among the hard northern barbarians, right? Those northern Europeans who have no talent for religion, the born warriors, the barbaric people in their very souls. But among the strong but bungled men, basically the people who had that excess of will to power but didn't turn out well, that's where religion really finds the fertile soil. Why? Because that's where resentment can take hold, but then turn creative in a really powerful way. And so this interaction between, we might say, the slave morality taking root in the soul of the master who has failed is the real origin of the Christian religion in its modern form. Modern, speaking here of up to the time of Nietzsche, although we could say we inherit the consequences of this as well. So we'll continue with the passage. Quote, even if the very highest credit is given to this considerate and preserving care, which besides being directed toward all the others, was and is also directed toward the highest type of man, the type that so far has always suffered most, nevertheless, in a total accounting, the sovereign religions we have had so far are among the chief causes that have kept the type man on a lower rung. They have preserved too much of what ought to perish. What we have to thank them for is inestimable, and who could be rich enough in gratitude not to be impoverished in view of all that the spiritual men of Christianity, for example, have so far done for Europe? And yet, when they gave comfort to sufferers, courage to the oppressed and despairing, a staff and support to the dependent, and lured away from society into monasteries and penitentiaries for the soul those who had been destroyed inwardly and who had become savage, how much more did they have to do besides, in order to work with a good conscience and on principle, to preserve all that was sick and that suffered, which means, in fact and in truth, to worsen the European race? Stand all valuations on their head, that is what they had to do, and break the strong, sickly over great hopes, cast suspicion on the joy and beauty, bend everything haughty, manly, conquering, domineering, all the instincts characteristic of the highest and best turned out type of man, into unsureness, agony of conscience, self-destruction, indeed, invert all love of the earthly and of dominion over the earth into hatred of the earth and the earthly. That is the task the church posed for itself and had to pose until, in its estimation, becoming unworldly, unsensual, and higher men were fused into a single feeling. End quote. So this speaks to two things. For one, our image of the higher man becomes the saint. The priestly aristocracy supplants the knightly aristocracy. The image of the higher man blends with the concept of becoming unworldly and unsensual. Right? So the sensations, that's what our immediate reality is. And the sensual person is the one who lives in this world of sensations. His wants are sensations. He feels, he is sensuous, and he is proud of this, right? And he is good at getting what he wants. And he rejoices in the earthly, in the sensual, in the world of phenomenal experience, right? That was the old aristocracy. The new aristocracy is what? It's the image of the man who is beyond this world, who is so fully denied the world that he stands in judgment and as this powerful figure before us because we can't understand, like, What did you get out of not, just begging for all your food and renouncing sex and renouncing money and renouncing all of these things to go live in a monastery, to take a vow of poverty or take a vow of silence or to beat yourself? This is what you're pursuing. And they say, well, I have something better than all of your all your sensual pleasures. I don't want the sensual. It's all something, it's all for something which is a higher ideal. And this is what the higher man becomes. This is the image of God, the image of the ideal man, is the man beaten and tortured on the cross, who endures his suffering with forbearance, who dies, who is tortured and beaten for all mankind. But that's fine because he lives imminently in the kingdom of heaven, rejects the world, and leads on the meek and the poor and the oppressed, holds them up to lead them on into the kingdom of heaven. More importantly, though, how does the Christian religion achieve this? It does this by it's not like they just took the strong, powerful, aristocratic, sensuous worldview and replaced it with the priest, and they were two different kinds of individuals. No, what Nietzsche's saying is all of those strong but botched individuals, all those failures among the master morality that still had this great creative power, they didn't just supplant them. They took them and they turned their creativity towards producing this new type of ideal. They became, the Augustines and the Calvins and the Luthers of the world. They became the creative force that was driving the elaboration and the development of the Christian morality and metaphysics. Their creativity, their inner creative child, sick and broken as they were, the religion that preserves the sick and the broken, the failures, the weak and the botched, right? Among the strong races, took them, preserved them, and then by that token transmuted them, warped them into this ascetic, this creative power of the ascetic. Okay, so that's Nietzsche's origin story for how master and slave morality intermingle and give birth to our modern morality. So we'll finish out the passage now. Quote, "Suppose we could contemplate the oddly painful and equally crude and subtle comedy of European Christianity with the mocking and aloof eyes of an Epicurean god. I think our amazement and laughter would never end. Doesn't it seem that a single will dominated Europe for 18 centuries? To turn man into a sublime miscarriage. Anyone, however, who approached this almost deliberate degeneration and atrophy of man represented by the Christian European, Pascal for example, feeling the opposite kind of desire, not in an Epicurean spirit, but rather with some divine hammer in his hand, would surely have to cry out in wrath, in pity, in horror, 'Oh, you dolts, you presumptuous, pitying dolts, what have you done? Was that work for your hands? How have you bungled and botched my beautiful stone? What presumption?' I meant to say, Christianity has been the most calamitous kind of arrogance yet. Men not high and hard enough to have any right to try and form man as artists. Men not strong and farsighted enough to let the foreground law of thousandfold failure and ruin prevail, though it costs them sublime self-conquest. Men not noble enough to see the abysmally different order of rank, chasm of rank between man and man. Such men have so far held sway over the fate of Europe, with their equal before God, until finally a smaller, almost ridiculous type, a herd animal, something eager to please, sickly and mediocre, has been bred. The European of today." End quote. And so the European of today is the man of modernity isn't just something that came out of nothing. The man of modernity has been cultivated by what? Religion. And this is why this passage follows the one before it, where he's talking about the religious ability to mold and shape and rechannel the feelings, moods, mindsets, values of the entire community, to be the alchemist of the spirit, right? Of the inner life of the community, to shape their mindset. And this single will, Christianity, the spirit, despite all the different interpretations of Christianity and everything that's transpired, it's almost like this single spirit, the single will has shaped the European man for 18 centuries. This inner content, which is pity, That's like in Zarathustra, Nietzsche truly believes that really you can, at the end of the day, when you boil away everything extraneous to Christianity, the most essential thing to it is that it is a religion of pity. And so there is something really important about Nietzsche, about Zarathustra at the end of the text saying, enough of my pity for the higher man, right? Because in a way he's saying here, his own pity that he feels for the extraordinary individual. Remember, the least likely person to turn out well in society, the truly extraordinary individual, is most likely to end up as one of those failed experiments. Let's look at this on the genetic or biological level. Mutation, most of the time, does not turn out well, right? But then you eventually strike on a mutation that is beneficial for the whole species, that drives the species forward. But imagine if you had to preserve all those bad mutations too. And so in getting rid of his pity for the higher man, Zarathustra really is saying, it's better off for the strong but botched type of person just to die off. They're a failed experiment. They might be something beautiful and noble, but Napoleon's wisdom that, fortune will have her way with me and then she'll break me like a glass when she's done, that this is a good thing. That the failures of all these great individuals, many of whom Nietzsche admires, was a good thing that they were cast down and destroyed, because the majority of the harvest of great individuals should be people that shouldn't be preserved. They're too strange, too rare, too maladjusted to the society to really live in it, and therefore to represent any kind of good innovation. But this pity, this all-encompassing pity, taught us to preserve those people, and they were allowed, the weakness within them, coupled with their strong creativity, was allowed to fester and mutate and become, create these monsters like John Calvin. Right? These psychotic individuals whose inner resentment and hatred for the human race was allowed to, again, one of those subtle oppositions, right? It was the love of human race, the love of man for God's sake. How do you get somebody like John Calvin who thinks that, in so many words, the all-powerful, the creator of the universe created billions of souls for the express intentional purpose of just destroying them and condemning them to eternal torment, and they never had any choice in the matter, right? It's like, what would you think of somebody who had a bunch of kids and immediately put them in a torture chamber, right? That you would think that's a psycho. That's something out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but that's John Calvin's image of God. How do you get to that? Well, you get to that by this steady degeneration of the European moral orientation, the European state of mind, the European sentimentality, by pity, right? That there is a downside, that if you don't let what is maladjusted, what is pathological, what is neurotic, perish through the cruel reality of nature, and instead try to preserve all of it, these monsters will then continue to breed and have their play in your, collective religious mind state. And that's exactly what has happened. And the result has been that they've created this contemptible, to Nietzsche, version of modern man. And so that is the end of what is religious. Next time we're going to look at the epigrams and interludes, part 4. And I've thought a lot about how I'm going to do this, and I think what we're going to have to do in part 4, because what it is, it's a bunch of 1 or 2 sentence at the most, little aphoristic statements that they're just short insights or maxims, right? They're, in the style of La Rochefoucauld or like a French aphorist. There are just so many of them, and they're on every conceivable topic. And a lot of the time, it's like a really big idea that's been condensed into a tiny little idea. And so I've thought about that. I'm like, how am I going to cover this? Because to go in and explicate or exegesize every single one of these would not only take forever, it's also like, the more important thing, it's counter to the spirit of what part 4 is. Right? It's a gruesome, ugly thing to take aphoristic knowledge that's been so perfectly condensed into this little expression of just the perfect, what is it? Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit. This perfect expression of that, and be like, let me belabor the point and unpack it forever, right? And say basically what was said very eloquently in an ineloquent and rambling way. Why would I do that, right? But there are some of these that are a little bit opaque, and I think there is a reason why this section occurs where it does. I think there is a logic to Nietzsche's structure where it may be important to get across some of these ideas. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to select the most important aphorisms from part 4 and talk about them as they relate, mainly the ones as they relate to bridging the knowledge elsewhere in the text with the knowledge that's presented elsewhere in the text. So, for example, I mentioned, there's so many of these that are perfect Nietzsche one-liners, right? But that not just because they're witty, but because they are like the perfect condensation of one particular idea in Nietzsche that you can then apply over and over again when interpreting his other works and reading through his other ideas. So I was bringing up, for example, the aphorism that we're going to talk about next week in this section. I have done that, says my memory. I cannot have done that, says my pride. Eventually memory yields. That's a really important aphorism. So we'll talk about that in relation to how that plays into the ideas we've already talked about in the past. I guess I'm just saying, like, the fact that I brought up that aphorism in this section when talking about part 2 or wherever it was shows you how these little condensations of Nietzsche's insights will be useful to cross-reference, right? And you will, if you become very familiar with them, be able to use them for that way. So we'll talk about how some of the things that we've talked about in sections 1 through 3 is elucidated by these aphorisms in part 4, and how some of them elucidate later parts of this book, sort of bridge into the back half of this book, which is a little bit more. So the first 3 sections, what are we talking about? We're talking about philosophers, the prejudices of philosophers, basically dogmatic universalist philosophy, and then free-spiritedness, which is, in so many words, perspectivism and psychology, and then applying that to religion, which are the metaphysics, right? The most profound metaphysical and moral beliefs, the mental framework by which we have operated in Europe up to the point of Nietzsche, right? And so that's the introduction to Beyond Good and Evil. Part 4 then gives us basically a crash course or a master class in applying this in terms of, we might say, I don't want to say unrelated, but individual, particular moral and psychological observations about mankind and society at large. It's this, part 4 is the method that we have developed in the first 3 sections applied. And then once we move on to part 5, it's the natural history of morals, which is an incredibly important section because it prefigures much of what happens in the genealogy of morality, but it is a further concretization of Nietzsche's method, right? A natural history of morals. We're going to look at morals as a natural phenomenon of living beings, animal beings, clever animals that invented knowledge. And then so too with scholars, so looking at a deep dive into the will to truth and how it's been institutionalized, and then peoples and fatherlands, politics, our virtues, and the final section, what is noble, Nietzsche's his application of these concepts like order of rank and sort of the implications of what human beings are like now that we've done away with all of those falsifications of the world, those metaphysical comforts that we have either explicitly or implicitly left behind after this passage, What is Religious? Because remember, in analyzing these ideas, Nietzsche calls it vivisection, right? So by peeking beneath the skin of what is religious, looking underneath at the beating heart of it and the inner workings, what happens when you vivisect something, right? It doesn't survive, typically, right? You've seen its inner contents, and now it's going to wither and die. It can't survive anymore in the light of knowledge. So I think that's enough. It's enough of me prefacing what else is coming in our Beyond Good and Evil read-through, but I'm very happy, actually, at the pace we're going now, and I think I don't know if I'm going to be able to cover one episode per section or per part of the text from here on out. There may be the need to split a couple as we've been doing, but that's going to be my goal because I think it's doable. And the beginning is so dense and it's hard to get into the mindset of Nietzsche and what he's doing. But now that we've established all of this, I think we can start moving a little bit quicker. And there will be more parts that I think we can justify skipping, insofar as it's only orthogonal to Nietzsche's overall philosophical project in this book. But I'm going to do that only very sparingly. I want it to be as complete of a reading as I can give you. So with all that being said, thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. Join me next week for part 4, the epigrams and interludes. Cheers, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.